chance to come up, be inside the depot or participate in one of these sessions that we've had down through the years. Kind of stuffy in here, but with these two fans going, that should help maybe get some rain coming through here. But what I like to do with these oral history nights, there's a particular topic I'm trying to cover, and then I want to see what people remember about that particular subject. So the topic I wanted to cover was dairy farming through the years. One thing I'd like to do is that I've taken quite a bit of time to try to make sense out of agricultural history in Tioga County in general, especially as it pertains to the era of the farmstead. And that's the first half of the 19th century. Now that's ancient history in a lot of ways, but if you know anything about our Herrick Barn project up at the farmstead, those are the first frame barns that were built when people settled the area, 1790s, early 1800s, and they were called threshing barns because their primary purpose was storage and processing of grain. They didn't come out here from Stockbridge, Massachusetts with a herd of dairy cows following them. Second quarter of the 19th century was a real massive change just in American culture and American economy in general. And that was kind of like the impact of the Industrial Revolution, changes in trying to be more scientific farming, and then looking for a market for your product outside the area. And that's when the switch was made to concentrate on dairy cows in this particular area, because this really isn't that great an area for grain. A little too wet. You know, a lot of you that have grown grain know what happens here when you're in that kind of a situation. But in general, it's a good place for growing hay and corn and for dairy cows. And so that's kind of where it started. The concentration back in those years went for butter and cheese, because those things were things that were more transportable as far as getting them out of the area. There wasn't really a market for fluid milk. And then once the railroad came in, and you could start shipping fluid milk down to New York City and the metropolitan areas, now this is more third and fourth quarter of the 1800s, that's when the fluid market came on, and that's when you saw a lot of expansion of the dairy herds around in this area. They started building bigger barns, taking the old barn frames, putting them together, and you know, places like Borden's opened up, and basically your dairy production, you know, kept increasing. Now, do you have any stories that went back, say, to the 19th century, as far as the farm was concerned? Now, I'll share one story that I picked up from Sheldon Davis, and he's somebody that on his mother's side, that farm goes back to the early 1800s. And he had heard a story that came down through the family history that back in the early years, they would take their cows over to West Creek to pasture them, because there wasn't enough pasture up in the hills yet. You know, there was still too much forest. But, you know, it's hard for us to imagine walking cows all that way for pasture, but this is the story that came down through. Now, your farm, you know, goes back, you know, well into the 19th century. Any particular story that you would urge the family about?
I guess we were the first ones that ever shot corn. My grandfathers told me about that. They put corn in the silo, they built silos and elevators and horse tread. And drop it in the silo, and then they'd chop it up with a broad axe.
With a broad axe? So the inside the silo itself?
Right, and then they go to the silo and chop it up with a broad axe, and then try to drag it out there. So it was a pretty hard situation to try to pull it out of the silo. And then we went to elevator with a horse tread. We had used to, in my time, I seen that little horse tread. That's how they built silos. And they got a 10-horse engine and international engine, and big flywheels on it, and pull them with the horses, chop them, and actually chop them and glue it to the side of that. Of course, my time, we used to handle hay with a cock it up in bunches, you know, and throw it on the line with my hand. And of course, the fork and the horse would go up.
Now, who would go up to the peak to bring, so you'd have to get the hay car down?
My dad was kind of strong, and he'd get it set way down on the wagon. You had to back the wagon in.
Wait for that wall, right?
Yeah, well, not only that, but he was strong, and he'd just set it way down, and all at once the rigging started going up too. So he had to back it up.
Well, my dad prided himself on getting 4 forkfuls out of a huge wagon.
Only 4? Yeah.
That's
Try
right.
to get them on.
Well, guess who used to pitch it
Now,
away?
is that the
Yeah,
grapple shirley
right.
or the harpoon style?
The fork that went down.
Well, there's 2 styles.
Yeah, the harpoon style. Harpoon style is
Yeah, we're going back a ways. I'm not as old as he is, but, well, I remember when my father used to trade off of his grandfather. Grandfather had 1 arm, but my dad said he was worth 2 men. To go over to the cemetery, ta-da.
Which cemetery?
The black one.
Oh, over there.
They used to go down from
Oh, right,
Hallsville
right.
to the farm, and
Yeah.
back then, you didn't pay anybody, you just traded work.
Yeah, well, see, that was all.
And the women got to feed them.
Yep, that was still all open down through there
Right.
back in those years, that, Livermore Farm that you done in over there on.
Yeah.
I know my dad has told me that my grandfather could remember when he was a young lad, that they used to milk somewhere between 60 and 70 cows on that farm.
By hand.
By hand,
Right.
and that all that state land over in there, well, my dad can even remember some of that up towards our property there, of putting buckwheat in and harvesting it.
Well, that became state land in 1933, but I looked at the ag census for 1875 for this Livermore farm. Yeah, and he had like 60, 70, he had a big operation. But he had, like 1870, he had 5 black field hands. He had 5 men working for him. But he had quite an operation. Does any of this relate to your experience?
Yeah.
Tell him, George.
Are you a snap?
I remember farming.
That's bushy. You know
Going out
bushy?
and bunching the hay, pitching on the
I
hand,
heard
pitching
you
it
talk
off
about
the hand.
grandfather in 1 arm, I
Up
remember.
on the
Father?
bay and another man up in there
Wayne.
catching it
I bugged him about his
and
beard.
fingering around.
Keep hoping to get
Then
turned.
they got the fork with the rope and pulley.
And you too.
You didn't have it, so with a fork with a rope and pulley, you can pull it up that way.
Now, what about chopping corn? Now, the first method was the elevator just brought up the whole stalk.
Full spot.
Yeah, I hadn't heard about that.
I don't remember that.
Chop it up.
Well, I didn't have to even before his time, but that's the way the first silos were loaded that way.
I don't remember that at all. We were modern, we had a corn chopper.
Blower.
Yeah, when we
Silo.
chop.
Well, that was before they ever had bores, so.
No, the thing that went in the field.
Well, that's field chopping.
Right.
Well, that was later.
A lot of people lost
Well, Shirley mentioned that my grandfather only had 1 arm, and that's the way he lost his arm, and what
In the
they
chopper,
called,
right?
well, no, that was what they called just a cutting box.
Yeah.
All that was run either by, it was run by a steam engine, and all that was a box that sat there that they just threw.
Okay, that was by the silo.
Yeah, but
And
what
you
you
fed
got,
it,
right?
and then it went up into the
Well,
silo, right?
the one that my dad said that what he could ever get of it, because my grandfather, of course, never talked an awful lot about losing his arm, but that was similar to like Carl said, but they had a cutting box and run it in with an elevator, but it was chopped up then.
What?
And he was, I think Dad said he was 18 or 19 when he lost his arm.
Okay, so what was the power?
Well, probably steam engine that run the cutting box.
Wouldn't it have been gas?
Oh, well, that might have been before gas now.
You cooking loose hay? You doing that?
Yeah, for a long time, until probably till 1950 or so. And the last gasp of the loose hay was the idea that we could have an air tunnel in the bottom of the mow with a big electric, 3 horsepower electric fan. powerful fan on it and put in relatively green hay and kind of cure it in the mow. That last little bit of curing that so often wound up with over-cured hay or wet hay. And that was the last gasp of loose hay handling. And by that time, there were no more harpoon forks. We'd done away with that, and we had these 4 big grapple tines. They were a lot easier to set, because you set one tine at a time of the 4, and they would take an awful big bite off a wagon load.
Well, when they first started coming out with balers that could tie them with string, you know, and your bales would be 40 to 60 pounds apiece. When did those come out around here?
Well, first of all, the 4-string, they were wire. And they weighed 100
In the
pounds.
forties, it was wire, and you had to
Spring bales come around.
have them
Yeah, but other people
around.
have them way ahead of us.
I thought they had to have wire to hold the compressed bales together.
You're
The
on the
problem
top.
with the wire was hardware disease. Boy, hardware disease.
Hardware disease.
Cows would eat the wire, pieces of the wire in the hay all the time. And,
Yeah, somebody cut a
yeah,
small chunk off,
yeah.
I'll eat it.
That's why they feed all our cows magnets.
Yeah, later,
Magnets.
that's right. Feeding them magnets to prevent that.
I think the biggest problem with the wire, that killed the wire, was the hardware disease when you said it. They went to the twine.
Well, they were just really tough to handle, or you just pick them up with a
Boy,
hook or something?
you had a hook.
Yeah. They couldn't handle them by hand.
You didn't grab them by the wire and throw them around, no, like you do that.
No, no.
You wanted a hook for them,
Yeah.
you want to be rugged.
As far as the first balers, though, would have been in the late 40s, because I know my dad has said that my grandfather pretty near tipped the tractor and baler over on that side hill behind our barn, and he passed away in 46. But that was a baler, though, that didn't have a pickup. Two
No.
men had to walk in front of it and
Oh, yeah.
and hand feed the hay,
is that right?
hand feed the hay into it, but it was on wheels so that it moved along,
Yeah, and there's somebody on a tractor pulling it,
pulling it,
and 2 people
people
feeding it.
feeding it, and then one person on the back end of hooking and the
Sticking
wire,
in the wires?
the wire, stuffing the wire.
I count, a 4-man team there at
Yeah,
least.
yeah,
Gas engine on the baler.
the gas engine on the baler.
Oh, yeah.
Because it was
Yeah.
just, I mean,
Wisconsin.
Those Wisconsins were a bitch to start after they got hot, weren't they?
I don't know, I never had the
Yes, they were.
experience.
So that didn't run on power takeoff. That
no,
was,
no, that was, yeah, well, the first baler that I can remember was a baler with a gas engine on it. And then the company, well, I must have been 7, 8 years old, come out with where you could take the gas engine off and put power takeoff onto the baler.
Your first tractor never had power takeoff, they just had belts.
Belts.
spent some time just with, you know, being with the cows themselves, you know, what was the process?
Okay, I got a point I want to make, see what these more experienced and older fellows think about it. I think we've lived to see a complete revolution in dairy cattle breeding.
I think when, to start with, and in the beginning of our era there was still the mystique of bloodlines in the breeding of dairy cattle and pedigrees and confirmation, particularly bloodlines and pedigrees, which went way back into the middle of the 19th century. I have a book of my great-grandfather's in which he very precisely recorded by hand a whole page of the ancestors of each one of his milking shorthorn cows by hand. It's unbelievable. There's no production record at all. No production record at all. Just the bloodline all the way back. A page for every cow.
Now, how far did it go back? What was the date on the earliest?
The dates on this were in the 1860s and 70s. He was in Minnesota at the time. And then later, moved to your place
Right.
in 1912, 13. But those records were from Minnesota. But we've come from there, partly thanks to, I believe partly thanks to DHIA, to the point where the production history of the parent lines is very, very important, more so than just the mystique of a name, of an ancestor's name. And the performance, even today, we're gone from the point, from DHIA records in which the herd averages and the individual cows' averages in production were recorded over their entire productive life, to scoring the genetic value of individual bulls. It's a totally different view of cattle breeding.
Of course, today it's somatic cell count, you never thought of somatic cell
Now,
count.
who ever heard of that, Carl?
Yeah, and when penicillin first come out, you didn't worry about it, you dumped it in the milk.
Yeah.
Then pretty soon, the government caught on to that, and they started nailing it right and left, there any antibiotics and milk. And now you come to, now today we're into protein, and we used to be just a fat, you got paid for them.
All milk solids?
All milk solids,
Yeah.
and that's where we're gonna, from now on, I think it's gonna be, we're gonna be paid on weight of
Right.
milk, you're gonna pay on the amount of solid you
Yeah.
have in them.
Yeah.
Go back to the 1930s for the, if we could say the average farmer in Tioga County. How many cows would you milk? What would be your production per cow? How did you keep track of production? What did you do as far as breeding is concerned? Did most farmers just have their own bull? Was there artificial insemination, back that early?
Okay.
You want to maybe take some time and kind of...
I used to have a bull. As soon as they come out with artificial, I got rid of him.
Yeah. What year was that?
What year was that? Remember?
Couldn't have been the 40s.
47.
47.
I think.
And most farmers bred their own cows up to that point?
Till that point. You either did, or you took your cow to a neighbor that had a
I
bull.
was gonna say neighbors sometimes had a better,
Neighbor sometimes had a better bull than you
option.
did,
Uh-huh.
so you take it there.
Now, how did you decide who had the best bull?
Not a bull.
I don't know what dam it was out of,
Yeah.
and so forth.
Yeah.
Some people
Sire.
had purebreds, you'd take them there to see if you could get a good,
Yeah.
They didn't
Good
produce, they
animal.
were Hamburg.
Up on our farm, I know my dad has told me that, like my grandfather and them, and my dad and uncles done it too. My grandfather used to get bulls off from Paul Smith, and then when my dad and uncles took over the farm, they done every year or two got a bull from either Fred or Bob Petzel when they were.
Yeah.
And just to change the bloodlines and
The bulls were dangerous, people
boy.
got killed, I had a great uncle killed by one, and I got treated by one too, so,
Yeah, they weren't,
yeah,
they
they
didn't
did.
kid around.
Ours would be led out with a rope through the ring in his nose
Right.
until Ray Shaver's older brother Ken got pushed right through the barnyard fence by one, and then we got a metal staff, with a hook on the end that you could operate from the handle.
yeah.
Otherwise, you needed two men to water the bull.
Right.
Yeah, to take him out to the barnyard anyway. If you're going to water him at the watering trough.
Gary, you had something to add about the bull builder?
Yes, ma'am.
The one thing I remember is over my uncle's place.
Just there was no bull you could trust. You
Yeah.
talk about being a mean bull. There was no bull that you could trust.
Right, right.
You shouldn't. I mean, you learned. I think everybody, those of us who are still living, learned that lesson early, probably.
sometimes,
I lived to be older.
sometimes you want to appear to be nice and
Oh yeah.
calm and peaceful, and all of a sudden you turn on you and you never knew.
I remember one time when I was a young fellow, my dad had a Ayrshire bull. He says he want her to flee. There was a fella come to buy him, he treat him.
Now, what I remember, being over at my uncle's place, this is off of 38B. It was sometime in the winter, and they let the bull loose basically in the, the aisle between the stanchions of where the cows were, And then whichever cows were ready to breed, that's where the breeding took place. This was in the wintertime. So that's what I remember about the process. How many of you milk cows by hand?
Never did it the other way.
I had to get up every morning and milk 10 cows before I went to school. That's why my fingers got like this. When I was young, I used to do that when I was 5, 6 years old. My fingers just grew like that.
And it's true after a while.
Yeah.
I only had to do it at night. Dad did it in the morning.
I had to go at night and morning and tell them we had about 45 head.
So that was your morning's work.
Well, I had to get up at 4 o'clock before I went to school. No, the barn.
Now, how long did it take you to do 10 cows?
I don't know, it took me about an hour and a half, 2 hours like that.
If I didn't milk them dry, Dad went out and checked it too. You better be sure you milked them dry.
Oh, yeah?
That was back when, before my dad, well, I guess I was just young too. They used to come around, you had to clean your pens every day. That had to be cleaned now. And today is, the law is completely changed. And you know, these bedding packs that build it up 2 or 3 foot. And Board of Health don't say anything to you, that's the proper way to do things. Things have just gone direct to opposite.
And then you had to contend with milk inspectors too. They came around and give you what for, and you had to do this and had to do that. So my dad never got involved in selling milk, but we had our own milk and milk products and meat.
Now, what do you mean you had your own milk and milk products?
Well, we didn't sell milk. We used it for ourselves, milk and butter and cheese and what have you.
You didn't take milk to the creamery?
No, because he wouldn't put up with the inspectors.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Well, what
So you
was
missed the
it?
whitewashing and all that?
Yeah, you had to,
It was the New York City Department of Health, wasn't it,
Well,
Carl?
you had New York Department of Health, you had
What's it
Livingston
state?
City Board of Health,
Yeah.
and then you had federal. And then you had the local, you had 4.
Well, a lot of us did that after got out of the dairy business. My dad switched to beef cattle, but we always had a couple for milking for our own milk and butter and stuff.
My dad never had mechanical cooling of his milk until after I was on the farm. He cooled it with well water.
that's right.
And,
Right down the well.
and then it dug well at that.
Yeah.
Or springs, some people had springs and they put it in the springs.
And the vat wouldn't hold more than 4 cans, so the most he could ship was 8 cans a day. 'Cause the morning milk you didn't have to cool.
How much milk would you get per cow back then?
I think you're probably averaging 8,000-9,000 pounds.
Well, I recall the figure, when I was in college, mid-50s, the state average with commercial dairies was 8,000 pounds. That wouldn't feed a cat today, you wouldn't think. It wouldn't feed the barn cats.
So what, now that's like what a cow would produce per year, 8,000 pounds of milk?
Yeah.
That was an average.
Average commercial dairies in New York at the time.
And what is it today?
Today, closer to 18, Carl?
More than that.
About 14.
State average, is that all?
I thought it was more than that.
I mean, a lot of them are up in the 20s and
Yes.
30, but
Yeah.
yes, that's a state average.
20, 22, 24 is getting to be pretty common, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, where did I see at the state fair last year, a Jersey heifer, on her first lactation, had produced a mature equivalent of 22,000 pounds. A Jersey heifer.
The Jersey?
A Jersey heifer.
Well,
Now, mature equivalent, not actual weight, but
It always told me that you never wanted to lose a federal order.
Bad, you already.
What's that?
The federal milk order.
Yeah.
You know, there was a time, back in his time, there was no federal order. These companies used to send the boarders here. In the spring of the year, when there was a flush, you dump your milk down the drain and find you made butter, you did something else, and we don't need your milk. Until we get along in the fall when they needed the milk again, and they would take the milk. And then federal order come in, where these companies come under federal regulations and they had to take their milk, and they couldn't just dump it anytime they wanted to. They had to pay a minimum price for milk back then, and that carried through the years, I'm just afraid today, there's a lot of pressure in this new what we just voted on, they wanna do away with all federal orders.
Yep.
And we may go back to the 6,000 and 7,000 cow dairies, these companies wanna pick them up, so they can just back in trailer trucks and load. And when a small guy, they just shove them right off. First, with the federal order, these co-ops have to pick up milk. But they can dock you some for one, but they do have to pick up the milk. Yeah, but that federal order goes, they won't have to do anything. They could just shove one after the other small farmer right out there. Because it's all getting to be big, and of course, I think a lot of it, why it gets big, because you got choppers that are up to $300,000, $400,000 now for a chopper. Tractors are over $100,000, and you've got to be big to handle
Right.
the cost of that kind of thing. You know, we ourselves, even though we got 300 head, we have to use used equipment, and fix up used stuff, we can buy at auctions and stuff, you just can't afford capital outlay or something like that.
Put that in perspective, I remember another statistic that surprised a school teacher of mine when I was in high school. He found it almost hard to believe that my dad had a $4,000 annual feed bill right here at the GLF. That was an astounding figure to that school teacher at that time, in the mid-40s, late 40s.
Now, you know, used to have when you're, years ago, you raised pretty well your own grain, you just put in some molasses and things. And then you went from mixing your grain with all the other commodities, wheat and all the other. And now today, you know, I haul commodities. And I get on the phone and I go around and find out who's going to sell me corn, or meal at a certain price, and soy at a certain price. Who's going to mix minerals. It's just a rapper issue going between one dealer after the other to buy commodities, and I get in the truck and haul out, sometimes out of Auburn, sometimes towards Buffalo, and all over the place, and then Buffalo.
That $4,000 would hardly pay his phone bill for a year.
Of course, you know, it's really, I can't see how a grain farmer can stay in business, because back, I know at least, 30 or 40 years ago, that cornmeal was more than $80 a ton. I can buy it now for $82 a ton. And that's what it was 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Think of the inflation.
A lot of commodity prices, price of
Yes.
eggs.
Yes, eggs. and that
Yeah,
price.
when we used to have about 5,000 chickens, you know, and we used to get 25 cents a pound for spent hens. Today, you can't even find anybody who even buy them. Farm Bureau tried to market for them at 5 cents a pound, you know, and it was trucking clear into New Jersey, and that market finally dried up.
One thing I had noted, I thought I'd bring up here is, my father always talked about the tuberculosis, you know, that ran through here in the 20s, and that really knocked out a lot of dairy cows.
Sure did.
Now, were you on farms that were affected?
When I was a kid, my dad had this dairy and he lost him to tuberculosis.
But there was one scrubby old
Everyone but
cow.
one cow.
One scrubby old cow.
So we told him to take her too.
What year was that?
That was
26.
26, I
26.
think.
Of course, the state used to inoculate for TB, you know, they inoculate them under the tail. And
Do they still do that, Carl?
A few days after you know, the state paid the veterinarians to do it.
Yeah.
Now today, that whole program's gone down the drain, and I know Kemp has told me that a good many times that, sooner or later, that's gonna be an outbreak again, and we're gonna have real
There
trouble.
will be someday.
So that's still a threat, but
Yeah.
they're not
I
really.
know my uncle was a veterinarian, and he, Dr. Kemp interned under him.
Yeah.
Back then, that was a real problem. That and brucellosis. You know. When we went to inoculate for brucellosis, now all those programs have gone down the drain.
I'd like to add
One of these days, they'll quarantine all the cattle in a certain area, and you won't be able to sell out of the area until the whole thing is cleaned up.
Yeah, you wanted to.
I'd like to add here that the cows were paid for, I think. But the government wasn't for everlastingly bailing farmers out. In his family, there was 11 kids, and they had a mighty hard struggle, his mother told me.
Did they get enough money for those cows that he could reinvest in another herd?
What did they do?
I don't remember. They didn't get very many cows back for what they 'cause they didn't get
Yeah.
much for
They
it.
gave an indemnity to the state, there's a federal indemnity and a state indemnity, I know we got that.
I didn't,
For, TB,
that was TB.
yeah.
I know my grandfather, back in the 20s, lost his herd to TB. I remember Dad saying that. As far as, well, of course, he must have bought back, because I mean, there was never cows, as long as my
Yeah.
dad can remember, that there was always cows on.
But it must have been, they must have had to outlay some capital,
Yeah.
you know, to get the
Yeah,
herd back up.
but, of course, back then, what Dad said that, when he was a kid, they Cripes only milked 8-10 cows, about all.
Is that about it?
That was about all. And of course, they had 400 or 500 chickens for the eggs. Because I know Dad saying that when they had excess eggs, they'd bring them down here to the station and crate it up and send them to New York.
This is kind of a tangent, but one of the stories my father always said, that especially during the Depression, it was really the eggs that saved the farm. It wasn't the price of milk. And that keeps showing up. I didn't know that your family had that many chickens.
Oh, that was, of course, that was back in the early years when they were still on the original homestead over in back there. By 40, when they moved out to where we are now, they didn't
Oh, I see.
keep that many chickens. Over on the original homestead, well, my great-grandfather, my dad said, I had what, 25, 30 hives of bees for honey, and of course, when my great-grandfather passed away, everybody else got rid of the bees because they said he had the meanest bees in the valley. But I mean, they had, well, and I've heard them say they also had sheep, and I mean, they had a little bit of everything.
Right.
They didn't depend all on just milk or anything back then for their.
You know, that day is one of the really ruined agriculture in this area. In another 2 years, everybody's gotta come under a permit system as far as that. You've gotta have a federal permit in order to farm it.
Federal permit.
All the big dairies, Bob Amon and people like that are already under permit system. For the 1st of July, they had to come under all the federal regulations and environmental. And these environmental regulations that you've gotta come under, there's no way these smaller farmers can afford to comply.
And it's because of manure?
Well, it's not like manure storage, it's the way you handle it.
Fertilizers,
and it's
pesticides.
also, the way you crop, you can plow some fields, you can do this.
Erosion
There's
control,
Drainage and
Yeah.
all the other things.
watershed protection.
They're coming under.
Oh, that's not,
It's just,
Ah.
there's no way that, you're gonna spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. The federal government's going, and what bothers me, I'm on that FSA committee, we can't get money to help the smaller farmers, to comply with that. We've had a few of them get fined heavy because run off from their barn cleaners and that. And the guys that get the money is the big dairies. And Bob Amon will tell you that every time everybody bitches about his manure, I get him another $1 million. The federal government, he said, I loathe to have them bitch because I get more money every time they do it. But we tried to get money for the whole county so the soil conservation could work with farmers that were in trouble and had to comply with regulations of DEC or EPA and all that thing. We can't get it. The only way that they will give money out is you have enough pollution problems so that they think you warrant big money to compete with. When he got a methane generator system.
Yeah,
That was
yeah, I
all
read
paid
about
for
that.
the federal government about $1 million. And that, also that juice goes back to NICEAG, so he's making money on federal money. I don't know how this whole system works. you know, I tried to get through the, top of Walsh, if you like this, you know, in their committee. And they said that they blocked grant to the states, and then the states through, property extension, soil conservation, some of the big wheels in Albany. They just decide what kind of projects are needed, and certain watersheds get this money, and others don't get anything. That's kind of, once you get fined, there's no federal money you can get or no state money, you're off.
Let's talk about manure.
That is manure.
Yeah. But going back to the 30s, you know, how did it accumulate? How did you get rid of it?
Shoveled it by hand, you
Put it
know,
on the
Hand,
field.
Put it on the wagon, threw it off the hand.
shoveled it off,
But
right.
you didn't have concrete drops that it went into, and then,
Well, you
Yes, we
had
had
to
to
drop
have
it.
yeah. So that was when some regulation that came along, what,
Yeah.
20s, 30s, that you had to have a concrete?
You had to have concrete.
So the first step in manure removal would be those gutter cleaners?
First step is get the wheelbarrow.
Yeah, yeah.
And the fork.
Used to have
Horse,
all
pulled by
those
horses to begin with.
tracks.
And in the
and
wintertime,
bucket.
if the fields had too
Dirt.
much snow for
Then
for the
you
horses
were
to
stuck.
So you
You
piled it
piled
up
it up
and
in
you
the
did it in the
barnyard.
spring.
Right.
pile it up and then forked it by hand onto the spreader in the spring.
Right.
But then they got to be so you couldn't do that anymore because the Board of Health wouldn't allow any piles of manure.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah?
And they stopped that right away. You couldn't pile, now it's all right. You pile it on, and they're gonna demand that you store all your manure now from December through to April.
Holy
You can't
cow.
spread. Vermont can't, New Hampshire can't, all the New England states have stopped. Canada's all that way now. You can't spread any manure.
You can't spread it.
Because of the runoff, Carl?
Huh?
Because of the runoff and frozen ground?
Because of the runoff, the frozen ground and all that.
Wow.
So what did you think of the first mechanical milkers? Now, you could have a mechanical milker even before you had electricity in the farm, couldn't you?
If you had gas engines
Oh,
or
yeah.
a plant of your own, you could.
Now today, what you do is over there now, the kid puts the milkers on, the computer takes it off. He sits there and listens to the radio and reads the newspaper, and the next batch of 20 come in. It's the same thing over.
Automatic takeoffs.
Everything's automatic.
Automatic
So don't
takeoffs.
stay on too long in the cow.
Now, who
When
remembers?
the computer screws up and
Yeah.
back, and the juice goes off, all the milk goes down the drain. So you can run like mad and shut valves.
Remember the old separators?
Indeed.
You separate your cream from your milk?
Right.
People that, had just for their own use, they'd pour it in there and they'd go around centrifugal force somehow and it would separate the cream from the milk and then you could make your butter and such and have your...
This is just a home use unit?
Yeah. One time my mother had
First hour.
the cream stored in a cupboard and it was higher than I was at that time and my sister and I did the dishes and plopped one of the dishes in it. Well, that was the end of that, so she did a big mess.
Another thing that we take for granted here, over the years, we have lots of water. We've got a federal act of Congress that established the Susquehanna River Basin Commission. And I'm afraid in the next year or two, we're all going to start paying for consumptive use of water.
I bet too.
Because, one thing I didn't realize, I met with a commission the other day, that Whitney Point of Dam over here is the only dam that releases water that the Army Corps of Engineers don't